he's gone on to really contribute to Africa. He's now involved in Liberia to ensure that that country has peaceful and credible elections that reflect the will of the Liberian people. And that's what we want in our leaders. You know, real commitment to the cause, commitment to the citizens, and commitment to Africa. And he's really standing to be counted. And you know, but it's not surprising. The first time I had the opportunity to see him at close quarters was soon after my appointment, and I accompanied Mr. President to Malta for the Commonwealth Heads of State Summit. And he was also there. And I recall very vividly the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, called a very early early morning meeting. And only a few presidents were invited, about five or six of them. Our president was one of them, and you know, I accompanied him there. And President Mahama was also one. And I was really taken by his razor-sharp intellect and complete mastery of so many different issues, and that was. And I thought then, yeah, Ghana, you know, is really lucky here.
There has been a quantum leap in infrastructural development in Ghana during the presidency of His Excellency. I was privileged to be in Ghana in 2013 and was familiar with the state of infrastructure at Kotoka International Airport and the Accra Metro. The facilities at Kotoka then, though functional, were fairly basic. However, when I returned in July this year as part of the EIMC study team, not even the very positive writings of Dele Momodu prepared me for the wonderful transformation at Kotoka. And the audacity of the infrastructural projects across Accra Metro. Though parts of it is still a work in progress, there was clearly no lack of ambition. And that, for me, was the greatest takeaway from His Excellency's presidency. And talking about changing African narratives positively, our guest lecturer, with his ambitious infrastructural development in Ghana, certainly contributed to the improved global perception of Africa, reinforcing the Africa Rising narrative. His peaceful transfer of power, which has been referred to his successor, not only consolidated further Ghana's strong democratic credentials, but also fed the positive narratives of Africa.
Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, His Excellency, Mr. John Mahama, for his lecture.
But let me thank you for the very kind words used to introduce me this afternoon. And Mr. Chairman, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and my friend, Mr. Geoffrey Onyama, the Director General of State Security, Alhaji Lawal Musa, and the Director of the Institute of State Security, Mr. MB Seyefa. Let me thank you for the kind invitation to deliver today's graduation lecture. I also acknowledge the presence of our High Commissioner of Ghana to the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I'm particularly honored that you graciously accepted to shift today's event from the original date of October 31st to enable me participate in a roundtable conference of the African Presidential Leadership Center in Johannesburg. The event saw 7 former leaders drawn from across the continent sharing our experiences on how to improve educational outcomes on the continent. Former President of Nigeria, Goodluck Ebele Jonathan, was one of the participants at this roundtable, and his contributions to the discussions were very insightful and revealing of the challenges and opportunities that face Nigeria, the world's most populous black nation, when considering policy options in the education space. The meeting in Johannesburg revealed the value of expertise one garners from having the privilege of serving as a leader of one's nation. It also gave life to the words President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf spoke at the inauguration of my successor, President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. She said to me, President Mahama, you have indeed demonstrated that there is life after the presidency. It gave me a sense of pride to hear these words. Of course, she said these words because of the work we did together in resolving the Gambian standoff and aiding the advancement of democratic consolidation in the Gambia, even at a time when I had accepted defeat in Ghana's election of 7th December 2016. And I think that was what my friend Geoffrey Onyama was referring to when he spoke about the work we did together in Gambia with President Buhari, President Nkrumah, and Her Excellency Johnson Sirleaf. Indeed, I think the main reason why I was added to that delegation was to serve as a good example to President Yahya Jammeh. Because he had lost the election and he had conceded and had called the victor and congratulated him. And then a week after, he reneged on the congratulations and refused to hand over. And so I had also lost the election, I had conceded. And so I guess I was added to serve as a good example for him and let him follow my example. I therefore wish to thank President Buhari for the privilege of working alongside him and President Johnson Sirleaf and President Nkrumah in unraveling the Gambian impasse. I wish the people of Gambia every success in the journey of consolidating their fledgling democracy. Since leaving office, I've been involved in many assignments, both to do with the consolidation of democracy on the African continent and also in election observation on behalf of the Commonwealth and lately ECOWAS. I remember the day after I had handed over on 7th January. This was the 8th of January. I woke up in the morning and remembered that there was no office to go to. And so I relaxed in my bed and turned on the TV and I was watching CNN. I spent the whole day watching TV. At the time, Donald Trump was the president-elect and they were going through the transition, waiting to hand over, and so I just kept watching what was going on. And then my daughter, who had gone to school in the morning, arrived in the afternoon, Farida. And she came and found me lying in bed, which was very unusual, because when I was president, we could go for a whole week without seeing each other. I leave the house, she leaves the house early in the morning to be able to get to school on time, by which time I probably haven't gotten out of bed. And then she gets back home late afternoon, and I'm in the office, and I get back in the night when she's asleep. And so we could go the whole week without seeing each other. And so for the first time, she came back from school, and there I was lying on my bed and watching television. And she asked me, she said, "Daddy, didn't you go to the office?" I said, "No. Don't you remember that I handed over to President Akufo-Addo yesterday?" He said, "Oh, okay. So it means you're not going to go to the office anymore." I said, "No, I have no office to go to." And she said, "Then I'm happy." "So will I be coming back from school and meeting you in the house?" I said, "Yes." He says, "I'm very happy you lost the election." So let me extend my warmest thanks to His Excellency President Muhammadu Buhari, CFR, and the staff of this esteemed college for the honor done me in extending an invitation to deliver the graduation lecture on this auspicious occasion. The role of your institutes is important in building that core of critical and strategic thinkers who we need to help transform the fortunes of this continent and especially of our sub-region. Your students are therefore a very special group of people who have been primed by their study here to play a vital role towards the development of not only Nigeria, but the continent and beyond. And so let me say congratulations to the graduating students. And let me wish you well in your endeavors and urge you to use the knowledge gained here to transform not only Nigeria, but West Africa, Africa, and the world beyond. May I also congratulate the national directors present here, the eminent members of faculty, and the non-teaching administrative staff for producing these fresh graduates who I'm confident will illuminate the African continent with productive, groundbreaking contributions that will make our world a more secure place than it is today. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, I thank you all for prioritizing to share time with me as I attempt to do justice to the topic of today, to tell you what I think are the challenges of democracy and development in Africa. In 2012, I launched a book, my memoirs, entitled My First Coup d'etat and Other True Stories from the Lost Decades of Africa. The book captures my coming of age in the late 60s until the early 1990s, a period when the initial euphoria of independence had faded, and we had become entrapped in a revolving door of military dictatorships, a period when Africa saw a general decline in its economic fortunes. In Ghana, the experience was particularly traumatic and saw a massive migration of many of our nationals to sojourn here with our cousins in Nigeria. It is a period during which our countries were still cooking in the governor's cauldron, a kind of laboratory in which different experiments in governance were being carried out. We went through these 3 decades in which we saw brief periods of constitutional rule interrupted by military dictatorships. Ladies and gentlemen, our continent, Africa, like many other parts of the world, has gone through these leadership experiments and has been struggling to find the best solution for advancing the hopes and aspirations of our people. This quest has been fraught with various setbacks and reversals, sometimes dimming all hope that this high natural resource endowed continent will ever find the right governance mix to actualize the dreams of our people for a better life. In this short lecture, therefore, I'll endeavor to highlight a few of the challenges confronting Africa's governance and development with the hope that it will add to the ever-raging debate on a myriad of perspectives and solutions. In my view, this continent's challenges are focused around a few key issues. 1, our quest for a better leadership structure in our countries. 2, the formulation and management of strategic interests. 3, the need for new paradigms of economic development. 4, the threats to democratic consolidation. And 5, the challenges of intra-Africa trade. If you follow the evolution of human society per the theory of the early philosophers, and I refer to Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau, it is posited that when humans decided to move from a state of survival of the fittest, in which they roamed in the bush, mainly in small family groups, and decided to start settling in larger societal groups, they needed rules and regulations to order society. This need came with the requirement for a system of governance to enforce compliance with those rules and regulations. This led mainly to the evolution of leaders who were considered to be monarchs. Every nation, every ethnic group or clan needs one form of governance or another to ensure the survival of its people, to safeguard society's interests, and ensure security and peaceful coexistence. Although there are various variants of governance, two main broad governance systems are recognized widely across the world. You're either a dictatorship or a democracy. While democratic and open governments are held up as the best system and dictatorships are frowned upon, I wish to state with emphasis that there is no one-size-fits-all system of governance. Democracies are generally preferred because of the protection of human rights, transparent and accountable governance, open government, free speech, and stability. But democratic systems also have the downside of high cost of periodic elections, the influence of special interests on elected leaders, and the general lack of a sharp national focus, in some cases because of the frequent changing of leadership and change of national development plans anytime such change happens, and also the generally slow nature of the decision-making process. Dictatorships will generally be led by a single political party, a military junta, a military or armed forces council, or whatever the leaders might wish to call it. Dictatorships will normally occur or be established after a military or civilian push. This results in the usurpation of power from the existing system, either a civilian administration or in some cases a monarchy. In Africa, the era of military coups seems to be fading into distant memory with the upsurge of democratically elected leaders. While democracy has generally taken hold in Africa, with elections being held regularly, there are still several situations in which elected leaders continue to cling to power, either by modifying their constitutions to remove term limits, age limits, or institute mechanisms that ensure that they stay in power as lifetime leaders of their nations. Democracy is a desirable ideal, and in today's world is more politically correct. It is therefore fashionable to put systems in place to legitimize even the most authoritarian of regimes. If such systems of legitimacy are difficult to implement, at least you can insert the word democratic in your country's name. And so, for example, the People's Democratic Republic of Gondwanaland, I'm not mentioning anybody's name to get into trouble. So you can just insert democratic in your name and you assume that you are a democratic government. But while democratic societies are desirable, the question we ask is, are dictatorships all negative? As I said earlier, there is no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to what governance system is more appropriate for which nation. Democracy evolves, and countries are at different stages of evolution in democratic governance. Democracy must not be imposed by external pressure. And we have several examples that illustrate what happens when there's an attempt to democratize a country in advance of the stage of development it has reached. We can cite the examples of Iraq and the war that has gone on in Iraq and the suffering the people have gone through. We can even come nearer home into Africa and cite the example of Libya and what the current state of Libya is. I believe that whatever the government of Muammar Gaddafi was, it is still better than the situation in which Libya finds itself today. We also have the example of Syria to learn from, which is going through a long civil war. But let's also look at some other countries that have seen rapid development. Let's take the example of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, which today is different separate states, and Russia, including Russia. After Gorbachev took over, there was a general push to transform the Soviet system. And Gorbachev retired or resigned from office in 1991 in December. After he resigned, the Soviet Union was dissolved the very next day. And the following day, Boris Yeltsin took over as leader of Russia. After Yeltsin took over, there was an attempt to fast-track the democratization of Russia and open up the society as quickly as possible. Now we all know what happened. The Soviet Union broke up, and Soviet Union, which had been the second world power, because we lived in a bipolar world, with US and Soviet Union being the world's strongest powers. After a while, Soviet Union became a second-class power, and we started talking of a unipolar world, where only United States was considered to be the most powerful nation in the world. Be that as it may, several years later, enter a former KGB agent, Vladimir Putin, and with restrictions of some democratic rights, restrictions of freedom of expression, and geopolitical maneuvering, he's managed to place Russia again as a major player, and as a counterforce of United States when it comes to the world's most powerful nations. And that's why I'm just giving an example about the systems of democratic governance and whether dictatorships are all negative. Dictatorship can be used to achieve certain ends. You can also look at the example of China. China is a dictatorship because it's a one-party state. And China, at the same time, has used market rules, opening up and deregulation to move the mass of its people out of poverty and move to the second place as the world's second richest country. And yet, the people have given up some rights. You don't have exactly free expression in China, and there are some things you cannot do in China that you'll be able to do elsewhere. So, governance systems are based on the peculiarities of the nation, they are based on the cultures of the people, and even though democratic governance is the ideal, like I said, it evolves and every country moves towards that ideal at its own pace. And so it must not be imposed as a necessity that people should adopt democratic governance. History abounds with further examples of authoritarian leaders like Lee Kuan Yew, Suharto of Indonesia, Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia, and Park Chung-hee, all countries in Eastern Asia who ruled their countries from the 1960s to the early 2000s in some cases. Now these people I mentioned are credited with using their dictatorial powers to put in place strategies and firm systems that ensured, among others, policy consistency and the accelerated development of their countries. Today we see Korea, we see Malaysia, we see Indonesia, we see Singapore, and see how rapidly they have progressed. In the period where that acceleration took place, they were under authoritarian governance. If you come closer home, the fastest growing economies in Africa today are Ethiopia and Rwanda. But we probably would not say that these are the most democratic or open societies in Africa. And yet they are growing and moving faster than several other countries that have strong democratic governance and creating a better life for their people. These examples have led some researchers to even posit that because democracy finds it difficult to bloom in areas with high numbers of illiteracy and weak institutions that abound in underdeveloped or developing countries, it is somehow beneficial not to make an early incursion into democracy. These examples have triggered the debate as to whether a nation should democratize first before development, or develop first before democratization, or even achieve the two in parallel, democratize while developing. It is worth noting, however, that the period of dictatorships in East Asia was during the Cold War, when the Western allies were busy forming alliances and creating the new global environment, as opposed to the situation now, where they act as global watchdogs for human rights and the respect for the rule of law. In Africa, parallel to the rapid progress that was being made in Singapore, Korea, and Malaysia at the time, Africa also had its breed of dictators. Instead of their unchallenged rule becoming an instrument of progress for their countries, their rule saw their nations decline into abysmal depths. And I'm talking of people like Idi Amin of Uganda. I'm talking of people like Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire. And I'm talking of people like Emperor Jean Bedel Bokassa of the Central African Republic. So yes, dictatorships in circumstances are unique in increasing the efficiency of governance by reducing delays in the formulation and implementation of policies due to the absence of the need for consensus and endless debates to implement projects or policy. For instance, you take our countries, Nigeria, you take Ghana. Before a project is implemented, it must be formulated from the ministry responsible, then it must come to cabinet and receive endorsement of cabinet, and then it goes to parliament, is properly debated, and assented to by parliament before eventually the project is implemented. Under dictatorships, they don't go through that. It's the dictator who decides that we must implement this project. He gives the go-ahead, and it happens. So they're able to implement projects much faster than we do in democracies. But the question we must ask is, at what price? Democracy is expensive, talking of the yearly ritual of election-related costs. Ghana's National Electoral Commission earmarked about $200 million for the 2016 election, whereas Nigeria's Independent National Electoral Commission budgeted well over $550 million for the 2015 election. But the benefit of political stability and its returns far outstrip the expenses of these exercises. The cost of transitions may be high, but the guarantees of political freedom, inclusion, respect for the rule of law, equality, protection of human rights, etc., cannot be overestimated in democracies. Apart from providing protective limits, these guarantees send a loud message to investors and other development partners as well. Any attempt to understate the benefits of democratically held elections is respectfully, therefore, a myopic perspective. Democratic elections also reduce the tensions in opposition elements' attempts to usurp power. This is because they are guaranteed an opportunity to compete with the ruling party for the general mandate of the people come elections. Normally in dictatorships, the opposition has no hope of ever coming into power, and so they think about other means which might involve the use of violence to forcefully remove the ruling party out of power. But in democracies, whatever happens, you know that in the next 4 years or 5 years, you'll get another shot to try and take power from the ruling party. Democratic governments also provide checks and balances against abuse of power and state resources, even though I must hasten to say that from what is happening in many countries, this guarantee is not always assured. Progress made under democracies are more sustainable because they are achieved by consensus and the participation of all stakeholders in decision-making. In dictatorships, progress can unravel when the object of fear, which is normally the ruler, is removed. Therefore, for the safeguarding of rights and freedoms, for the protection of the public purse, and the general reduction in the number of insurrections, Africa is better off operating an imperfect but highly effective leadership structure of democracy than to accept the high risk of dictatorial rule. Strategic interests relate to natural complementary interests in the long-term defense and geopolitical concerns. These interests are either overt or covert and materialize during classified bilateral or multilateral talks, or what in the intelligence and security environment you describe as sinister operations of foreign agents in diplomatic missions. For every portion of Africa's gold, uranium, timber, or oil, there are foreign countries that believe that it's their strategic interest and will ensure that those interests are protected. African leaders have to navigate these dangerous waters for several years, sometimes leading to the overthrow of a leader who strongly believes that he cannot allow his country's resources to be raped by foreign countries at the expense of his people. For a long time, foreign interests have largely succeeded because many African countries have not been able to entrench their national interests within their democratic institutions. They have succeeded because the quest for power often trumps the safeguarding of our national interests. I recall the decision to fight illegal small-scale mining in Ghana when I was president, and my decision to approve the deportation of some foreign nationals that were neck-deep in this brazen destruction of our forest reserves and our environment. I experienced a strong pushback from foreign interests, but that is a story for another day. I'm not going into the details. I therefore propose that African leaders must make efforts to define their own national interests and ensure that, just like the Western countries, we take collective and entrenched positions that do not vary irrespective of who is at the helm of affairs. The national interests of African countries must also reign above all other interests. This will not only guarantee our socio-economic development, but will also curtail the intrusion of foreign agents in our democratic space. The current worldview of economic relations is one that pits one nation against another in what has become known as a zero-sum game. As you are aware, the world environment has kept changing. We had the post-war era, that was after the Second World War, and then gradually we slid into what was called the Cold War era. After the Cold War era, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Iron Curtain and the dismemberment of the USSR, we entered an era that was called the era of globalization. It appears we are entering a new era. There has been no proper definition or description of that era, but it is obvious that the era of globalization is transforming into something else. This new era is characterized by the rise of populism, the rise of far-right extremist parties into government. It is characterized by an increase in xenophobia in many countries. And so when President Donald Trump says, "America first," it characterizes a new era into which we are moving. The era of globalization had seen consensus building amongst countries and joint decision-taking, a very prominent role of world organizations and bodies like the United Nations and others. And that's how come we were able to together sign an agreement for ameliorating climate change in the world. But currently, for instance, you take America is withdrawing from the climate change agreement and reversing several, agreements that it had become a party to with the rest of the countries of the world. And everywhere you go, far-right extremist parties that are anti-migration are becoming popular and attempting to take power in those countries. We're therefore in a situation where one country's gain is another country's loss instead of a win-win. And this has led to the formulation of various strategies to protect each country's interests from being undermined by the operations of others. As has been well elaborated by Han Jung Chang, a professor of economics at Cambridge University, in his book, Kicking Away the Ladder, the very methods applied by the developed countries to get to the heights that they have reached in their socio-economic development is being denied developing countries such as Africa due to regulations. In the development of these advanced countries, they use things like subsidies, protection of infant industries from unfair competition by external forces, the non-enforcement of patent rights, and fair credit terms or the availability of credit to develop industries that directly compete with foreign interests. But then once you climb and you reach that height, the book says you kick away the ladder so that nobody has the ladder to be able to climb and reach where you are. And that is what they're doing to Africa. So now their economists and experts come and tell us, no, you shouldn't subsidize your farmers. Your farmers must learn to compete with the rest of the world. But then in their case, to be able to reach where they were, they subsidize their farmers. And in many cases, they are still subsidizing their farmers. And then they use phytosanitary and all kinds of non-tax measures to prevent us from being able to export into their markets. The problem is not insurmountable if we determine to work together towards a solution. This is the time for us as Africans to commit towards finding solutions that are in our interest and in the interest of the economic expansion of our countries. It is time for us to truly start finding solutions that present what game theorists call a win-win outcome. Because in the absence of better opportunities for mutual benefit, the industrialization drive we're pursuing will always be obstructed by those who have always used our raw materials as inputs for their industries to create prosperity for their citizens. For instance, you take an example of cocoa production in Ghana. Ghana has produced cocoa since colonial times. And currently we still process barely 30% of the total cocoa that we produce. And yet if you look at the price of cocoa beans, it has a tendency to fluctuate. A year ago it was at $2,900 per ton. Today it's selling at barely $2,000 per ton. And yet the price of finished goods that are processed out of cocoa maintain a stable price. And so the price of cocoa butter remains the same, it hasn't changed. The price of cocoa powder remains the same, it hasn't changed. And that is why I outlined the policy by 2020 to process at least 50% of the total cocoa beans that we produce in Ghana. And it's my hope that the current administration will continue to put in the means so that we can add more value to the things that we export. The same should go for Nigeria, and I know that very positive work is taking place to make Nigeria the hub for petroleum production in Africa. And I think Nigeria can do it. As a major oil producer involving the private sector, and I'm aware that Dangote is building some refineries and tank storage capacities, it should be possible to process Nigerian oil locally into finished petroleum products and export them to the rest of West Africa and the rest of Africa without us having to import petroleum products from outside. Speaking as a former leader of an African country, I can tell you that our quest to build our countries into industrialized economies that can begin refining our own raw materials and manufacturing what we need is not a development paradigm that the rich nations are enthused about. It is also important to look at what the growing threats to democratic consolidation in Africa are. And these include the lack of jobs for a fast-growing population, inequality, election fatigue and mistrust of the political elite, and lately, the effects of election disputes. Africa currently has the fastest growing population in the world. It is said that persons under 35 constitute almost 70% of the African population. With improved educational outcomes, the challenge of finding jobs in our economies to absorb these teeming numbers of young people is a dire threat to the stability of the continent. As a result of the Millennium Development Goals, most of our countries achieved universal primary education. And so we have almost all children of school-going age being in school. We also achieved gender parity in school enrollment. And so as many girls are going to school as are boys. And with the developments that we're putting in improving educational outcomes, more of these students are going on to complete basic education. For instance, in Ghana, we have the free compulsory universal basic education. And so parents don't have to pay any fees until the children finish junior high school. And just recently, we are implementing a policy to introduce free senior high school. And so it means that more children are going to be able to continue and complete school. And the question is, when they have completed school, technical school or secondary school or whatever level they finish, where are we going to find the jobs for them? In Ghana, the entire public service is made up of 600,000 people out of a population of 27 million. The public service is only 600,000. And if you take tertiary education alone, we're producing 50,000 graduates every year. And so you have 50,000 graduates every year coming out of university and other tertiary institutions and hoping to find work in the public service. It's going to be difficult. And that is why we need to start equipping these young people with entrepreneurial skills to see themselves not only as employees, but potential employers, and to give them the skills that make them able to go out into the world and set up their own businesses. Transformational thinking is required here, accelerating the growth of African economies, promotion of entrepreneurial spirit, creation of more opportunities for the private sector, especially in the agriculture and agribusiness space, are all urgently needed to address this burgeoning threat. We need to address the threat of the ever-increasing African population, or it will become our time bomb. In school, we took pride in disproving the Malthusian theory of population. For those of you who did economics in O-level or A-level, you remember Reverend Thomas Malthus, who came up with his theory of population. He said that population is growing at a geometric rate, and that food production and resources are growing at an arithmetic rate. And so a time will come when the population will far exceed the availability of food and other resources, and it will lead to civil wars and strife and all that. But then in the 60s, a lot of science was applied to food production. Fertilizer was discovered, and so food production increased. And the dire predictions of Thomas Malthus did not come to pass. But Malthus' shadow still is very present, especially for Africa, if we don't take advantage of our opportunities, because the rate of our population growth is outstripping and outpacing the rate at which our economies are expanding and growing. And so you find that you're having to find more resources to build schools to accommodate the more number of children that we're having. You're having to build more hospitals to accommodate, the ever-increasing population. And yet, if you had a slower growing population, the resources would be able to outpace it and create a better quality of life for the people in any nation. And so it's something that we need to look at, accelerate our economies, but at the same time ensure that we slow the growth of the African population. We can do this naturally by educating our people. It is said that when you educate a woman, she has the tendency to want fewer children that she can look after properly. And so you find that with in all the surveys that have been done, between illiterate women and educated women have a tendency to have fewer children than illiterate women. And so putting all girls in school and keeping them in school and not taking them out early just when they finish junior high school and marrying them off is something that would assist in controlling population growth rates. Often girls, when you finish class 6, they'll be about 12 years of age. Then they go into junior high, which is 3 years, and so they come out of junior high at about 15 years of age. If they go into secondary school, that will be another 3 years, senior high. It will bring them out at 18. At 18, they've attained the age of maturity. And so if girl children continue till at least they... And so it's something that we must continue to encourage, that as many girls must continue as far as their potential can take them, not only to secondary school, but into university and other tertiary education and training. African leaders must act fast to address geographical inequalities in order for their people to feel that they have a stake in the preservation of the nation state. There are still many countries where infrastructure and development is limited to the capital and a few urban centers, while the rest of the population lives in squalor without adequate access to essential social services. If people feel that they are treated unequally and that others have a better share of the national cake than them, and that the state has excluded them, then they have a tendency to not care whether the state survives or not. And so where you have pockets of poverty, where people have no hope and are reduced to a life of begging, then they become very fertile recruitment candidates for terrorist organizations and things like that. And so one of the commitments we must make as African leaders is to spread the fruits of growth geographically so that every part of our country, experiences that spread. And we can only do this if we decentralize and put power in the hands of our people. Let them take their destiny into their hands and put in systems that ensure that the resources of the nation are spread to the local government level. In Ghana, we have a facility, and I know you have something similar here. We call it the District Assembly's Common Fund, where the Constitution says that 8% of gross revenue, government revenue, must be distributed to 216 districts. And they draw their own budget on how they want to use it. And this fund, it's called the District Assembly's Common Fund, has enabled districts to build their own clinics, build their own schools, repair their roads, and extend electricity, provide water to the people, give good health care. And so for at least 216 districts spread across the length and breadth of the nation. If you go, you have a local government office, you have a police station, you have a hospital, you have a school, you have light, you have water. And so it makes the life of people more meaningful, even if they live in their own local government areas. And so we must work for equity in spreading the resources of our nation so that everybody feels that they have a stake in the survival of the state. Other threats to democratic consolidation include election fatigue and a sense of cynicism amongst the voting population in democratic African states. Every 4 years or 5 years or whatever the term may be, they turn out in their numbers to vote for the candidates of their choice in the hope that they will experience visible improvements in their circumstances. Unfortunately, in many cases, this is becoming a mirage. Slow growth of our economy and fast-growing population is creating a situation where people feel that it is pointless to continue voting the political elite into power with no direct benefits for themselves. And so every few years they come out, they stand in the sun, they queue, they vote, and they don't see any visible dramatic change in their lives. And so this is spawning election fatigue and also a mistrust for the political leadership, especially in circumstances when we as leaders make our promises go over the top. Sometimes we make promises that are pie in the sky and they are not achievable in the short term. And when it does that, the people get disappointed that those promises were not fulfilled, and it makes them lose trust in the democratic system. Election disputes too are an issue we need to look at. Recently, I was in Kenya for the elections, and I'm not talking of Kenya alone, but I'm talking of the whole of Africa. It looks like nobody loses an election. It is good to win, but when you go into an election contest, there can be only one winner. Somebody must be prepared to lose. And so it's as much about winning as it is about losing. You must be magnanimous in victory when you win, and you must be gracious when you lose. Unfortunately, we have not learned to lose. It's a zero-sum game. We want to win at all costs. And so at least we have developed the civil approach of pursuing our grievances according to the constitutional tenets by going to court. But at the same time, we must be careful that we don't put the courts in a situation where they interfere with the electoral process and they become the determinants of the outcome of elections. We can all see what happened in Kenya. It was good Raila went to the court. The court overturned the election and said that another fresh election should be held within 60 days. I'm sure you've all seen the drama that has taken place. And the thing is, our countries are countries put together of diverse people, and we're trying to build a nation state. And so sometimes the uncertainty of these things create ethnic tensions that could divide a nation. And so we currently have Liberia. Liberia held elections. I was there as an observer. I don't know whether I'm jinxed. Looks like any election I go to, somebody decides to go to court. But elections were held in Liberia. On election day, I mean, things went well. We found out across the whole country. We covered most polling stations. And things went normally, except in a few instances. There's no perfect election, we realized. There would be some irregularities. What to consider is whether the sum of those irregularities had the effect of making the integrity of the election suffer. And so just come out and say, oh yes, there were irregularities. You know, but what was the impact of those irregularities? Did they have the effect of changing what the outcome of the election should be? And so if we are always running to the courts and getting the courts to make the determination of who the actual winner is, I think it's not a good precedent. And so, yes, we must use the courts, but I think that we need to exercise caution in drawing the courts always into our election processes. Intra-Africa trade. With all the strategic interests of foreign partners and the various socioeconomic impediments from foreign interests, why is it that Africa still puts even more impediments in our own way by preventing trade between ourselves? And here, I wish to state that if you look at the growth of different regions of the world, there have been key countries that have been the drivers of that growth. And so if you take, for instance, Southeast Asia, you find that Japan was critical in the investments that took place in most of the Southeast Asian countries to put them at the stage where they have been able to expand their economies rapidly. And I believe that in our part of the world, there are countries that are critical to being able to do that. In South Africa, in the Southern African region, South Africa as a country is investing in Botswana, it's investing in Zimbabwe, it's investing in Zambia. And indeed, they are even stretching and investing here in West Africa. In Nigeria, there are South African businesses. In Ghana, there are South African businesses. So countries become the key drivers for the general development of the entire region. And I believe that in West Africa, Nigeria has a certain responsibility to the West African region. You cannot shirk that responsibility, because it is not only the largest economy in West Africa, it is the second largest economy in Africa. And so if Nigeria gets its act right and accelerates its economy and impacts on economic development and trade in the West African sub-region, it will drag all the other 14 West African countries along with it. And I've said before that Nigeria has nothing to fear from any of the other 14 countries. You're larger, you have more resources than any. Ghana is the second largest economy in West Africa, and yet its economy is probably just about a quarter of Nigeria's economy, or much less. And so Nigeria has nothing to fear from Ghana in terms of competition. And that's why when I was president, we used to have discussions about Nigeria's prohibition list. Every year, Nigeria publishes a list and says, you can't import these items into Nigeria. It doesn't matter where they come from, West Africa or East Africa or Southeast Asia. And I tried to impress on my friend, the president at the time, Goodluck, that I didn't think it was fair. I mean, an exemption should be made for the West African sub-region. because how much can Ghana really export into the Nigerian market to have any impact? But of course, you have a very strong industrial organization, the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. That is a strong lobby group that always puts pressure on governments to publish this prohibition list. But until we trade amongst ourselves, we would not benefit from the critical mass that we need to be able to develop. All our trade channels are channeled externally. And so most of our trade directions are to Europe and other places, but then the trade that should take place between our countries is at a low level. It's estimated that Africa total trade amongst ourselves amounts to about 11%, which compared to other parts of the world is the lowest. And so what do we need to do? We need to take down those barriers. Those barriers are artificial anyway. Some people sat at the Berlin conference and just took pen and paper and drew the lines across the African continent and split it amongst themselves. And so it happens that we all got liberated from different colonial masters. And we've maintained those borders. Even if we maintain them for political purposes, there's no problem. But for purposes of economic growth, our countries need to open up those borders. In West Africa, we took an early lead. West Africa was the first sub-region in Africa to allow visa-free travel of our people across our sub-region. And so if you're a West African, you have visa-free travel to any other West African country. But we have been slow in the other aspect of it, allowing free movements of goods and services across our borders. And so in that regard, countries like regions like East Africa have overtaken us. Regions like the South African region have overtaken us. They have more trade amongst themselves, and they move more goods between themselves than we do here in West Africa. And so that's one of the things that we need to look at urgently if we are to develop. And I'll just give you a few statistics. The UN Statistics Division 2015 shows that Ghana imports from other African countries as a share of its GDP, only 3.8%. Indeed, Nigeria is infinitesimal. Nigeria is not sufficient, so it couldn't reflect on the scale. And Central African Republic is 1.2%. But there are economies that are doing well, and that's why I said places like East Africa are doing very well. Zimbabwe imports from other countries on the continent 43.4% of its GDP. And Swaziland is next at 30.3%. If it comes to exports, Ghana exports to other African countries only 1% of GDP. So it starts with removing the barriers to trade, such as unnecessary custom checks along our roads, tariffs, impediment to migration and operating businesses out of one's country of origin. And I'll give you an example. China is a more than billion strong population country. And I remember as Minister of Communications, I went to China to visit their communication sector and then see how we could collaborate. And I visited a factory where they were manufacturing television sets. And the owner of the factory told me that their market share is 40 million pieces. So they manufacture 40 million television sets every year per annum. And then what he said was that, he said after they have fed their market share of 40 million, they have recouped their investments many times over. So if they manufacture any other TV set, they can afford to give it for free to anybody. And so they manufacture 60 million, 40 million for the local market, and 60 million they can price as cheap as possible for export into the international market. So what does it mean? It means that if you have a critical mass of a larger market, then you get economies of scale because you are able to reap on your investment due to the scale of the market that you have. And so if Africa was a 1 billion population market without all those boundaries and borders, then it means that we'll enjoy those same economies of scale that industries in China enjoy. And so if you are a tomato processing factory and processing processed tomato, or you are manufacturing, what do you call it, this thing that children like, Indomie or something, for the whole of Africa. I mean, imagine the economies of scale of producing Indomie for 1 billion people as compared to producing Indomie for 170 million people. Definitely economies of scale are important. And so we need to look at and redraw the lines across Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, as I get to the end of this lecture, my conclusions, I would like to conclude by saying that Africa's destiny lies in the hands of Africans. We cannot expect that anybody will come from anywhere and develop our continent and our nations for us. We must take our destinies into our own hands. And it is possible to do. In some sectors, we have put in the right policies, and the effects are there to show. If the policies are right, you will reap the results. As Minister of Communications, when we started the deregulation of telecommunications, today, Africa is the most dynamic continent when it comes to telecommunications, especially with mobile GSM telecommunications. We have faster growing broadband access than any other part of the world. And so there are things that we can do that if we put the right policies in place, we would reap the appropriate harvest. Today, mobile money that was essentially developed in East Africa from Kenya, M-Pesa, has become the model for the rest of the world. And so it's being copied in East Asia and other parts of the world. But it began its development here in Africa. And it's spreading across. In our countries today, people are using the mobile money platform to pay monies and do things. What we did in telecoms, we can do in energy. How come everybody has phones today? And there's infrastructure across the whole of Africa allowing people to communicate. Can't we do the same with power? If we allow strong private investment by putting in the appropriate policy to enable power supply to spread across the continent. Because without power, you cannot develop. There's no way we can develop and catch up with the rest of the world if you don't have power. Because you need power to establish those businesses, to put in the processing capacity. And you can't compete if you're having to generate power from more expensive sources. And so if you use a generator while somebody else has access to a national grid, you cannot compete in the cost of your production. And so these are things that we need to look at. Africans must take our destiny into our own hands, and the earlier we work towards our national and continental security and placing those imperatives above the interests of external forces, no matter the consequences, the sooner we will realize our inherent greatness as a continent. It is time we expand the purview of our national security and development to cover not only the protection of state actors, but also the research, development, and implementation of elements that border on national advancement and institutionalization of national interests within the public service of our countries. Personalization of power may have an allure of its own, but no one rules forever. The best way to guarantee development of our generation and descendants is to institutionalize national values and interests. I want to thank all of you for your kind patience and attention in listening to me, and I thank the authorities for this kind invitation, and may God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria and also bless the Republic of Ghana. Long live Nigeria, long live Ghana. Thank you.